Talk to me about inflation, because I was looking at some of the inflation numbers, and you have to go back to the 80s to see anything that's approaching double digit. I remember being just a kid hearing about double digit inflation. I could kind of remember the gas pumps, the lines at the gas. It's like a distant memory of me in the 70s. But how do you talk to younger people these days about what inflation is or it means? Because I don't think people really grasp what it actually means to your savings or to the economy in even a medium term.
Brian, you're right when you say we're putting up inflation numbers today that are the highest in 40 years. That is correct. A little 41, actually it was 1981 before we saw these numbers. But I remind people, the inflation in 1981 was the end of a 10-year period of inflation. It wasn't the beginning. You say, oh, that's inflation. Yeah, we did, but it had started. In some ways it started in 1968 and it really took off in 1974, 75. So 81, these numbers, that was when Volcker finally got it under control. But you go back to 70, between 77 and 81, so that 5-year period, the dollar lost 50% of its purchasing power, not 15, 50 in that 5-year stretch. So you were putting up numbers, 10%, 11%, 13% and higher year after year. And yeah, 1981, it was 9 or 10, which is what they're comparing to today. But that was on the downslope. It had been higher than that in 77, 78, and 79. So the question is this the beginning of an inflationary surge where it's going to get even worse and it's going to last 5 years, or is it different than that? But keep that in mind, because the 40-year comparison, it is correct, but that was the tail end of an even worse episode.
And I think, Jim, you've actually said that this inflation is going to turn to deflation faster than most people realize. Can you explain what that means and then what that looks like, and then maybe the ramifications of that?
Sure, that is my view. I'm happy to explain it. And it catches a lot of people by surprise. They're like, wait a second, Jim, it's inflation. You just look at 2022, starting in January, it was kind of like 7%. And then it was, it's 8.1, it's 8.6, now it's 9.1, which is true. That is this year. It is going up. So people extrapolate that. And again, there is this comparison to the 70s. By the way, I think the situation we're in today is very different from the 1970s, and I'll explain why. But, I'll explain why right now, because in the 70s, it was triggered from the supply side with first the Arab oil embargo in 1973 as a result of the 1973 Arab-Israeli war. And then the price tripled, but it went from like $2 to $6. Okay, but percentage terms, that's a huge jump, but it was still $6. And then it got to 12. And then in 1979, you had a second oil embargo because of Iran and the Ayatollah and the revolution and the hostages and all that. And then it went from kind of 12 to 20. So oil went up by a factor of 10 in the course of the late 70s because there's two different embargoes. So that's coming from the supply side. But what happened was, the other source of inflation is on the demand side. So you have what's called cost push inflation. That's where supplies choked off, or there's an embargo, or there's a shortage, of natural disaster, a lot of things. It's coming from the supply side, and demand is inelastic, so you just pay up or kind of do without. But the demand side is much more psychological. That's called demand pull inflation. That's when consumers behave the way I described, and as I say, I lived through the 70s, where hey, I better buy it today, I better buy it now. You're pulling all this demand forward and bidding up prices because you're worried that it's going to get even worse. So as that applies to today, we are starting with the cost push inflation, mainly the price of energy, but the price of food is a big factor. And of course, they're related. It's like here's the energy, here's the food. Where do you think the food comes from? To get the food, you got to feed the pigs and cows. What do you feed them? You feed them corn. How do you get corn? Well, you grow it on a farm. You need nitrogen fertilizer. You need diesel in your tractors. You get the food. You got to put it in a truck to get it from point A to point B. That requires diesel. The higher the diesel price, the higher the cost of food because you're moving it by truck, etc. So these things, as I say, are linked. But food prices are going up substantially, and you can't. The two things you can't do without are gas in the car and food. So you have that cost push inflation. We're not quite at the stage where it's demand pull. We're not quite at the stage where individual consumers are behaving the way I described in the 1970s, saying, "Hey, better spend the money fast because it's losing value," and you see that in inflationary expectations and inverted yield curves. And I'll come back to that because that's a really big deal. If you thought inflation was going to run away, as it did in the 70s, yield curves would be steeply sloping, and people would be in a frenzy to buy stuff. They're not, and the yield curves are not sloping, they're upward sloping, they're inverted, they're going down. That tells you that, and we also see this in inflationary expectations. Inflationary expectations don't drive inflation here and now. But what does is inflation here, and inflation here and now can feed on itself. Inflationary expectations don't drive it, but they tell you a lot. They're information rich. They tell you a lot about what people expect. What the yield curve is telling us, what inflationary expectations are telling us, and other factors are telling us is that, yeah, there's inflation now, but the Fed's going to kill it, and they're going to kill it by destroying demand and throwing us into a recession. And here's where it gets interesting, because you could flip from this kind of inflation to disinflation or even deflation very quickly. And people are definitely not prepared for that. Well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Kind of everyday consumers are prepared for it. I'm not sure Wall Street and mainstream economists and policymakers are prepared for it. They're just extrapolating the inflation, saying, well, the Fed's going to kill it. Yeah, they might kill it, but at a price, at a very steep price. And consumers are really bracing for that. So, this even Jay Powell said the soft landing is a myth. It's not going to be a soft landing. It's going to be a hard landing.